Back then, I knew nothing, and I spent my time suspecting my husband. It happened nearly 10 years ago. In my 30s, I was living married life with my husband, whom I had married not long before. I imagined that life with my husband, who had been busy with work even before we got married, would have many misunderstandings. But the time he spent away from home was so long that I felt like I was living alone. At first, I tried to comfort my husband when he could finally relax at home for the first time in a long while. But as time went on, my dissatisfaction grew, and I became harsh with him every time I saw his face. My husband was troubled as a result and tried to comfort me. However, when he realized that it still didn't satisfy me, he stopped responding altogether. No matter how busy his job was, as we were married, I wanted him to pay attention to me too. That feeling prevailed, and I couldn't look at my husband objectively anymore. When I picked a fight with my husband, he would always say, "I'll finish work soon, and then we can go to that island you love." But that never happened, no matter how much time passed. "You care more about your job than me, don't you? Then don't bother coming home. I'm tired too, and when I see your tired face, it makes me even more miserable." I continued to hurl hurtful words at my husband. But seeing his attitude of not giving me any attention anymore, I began to vaguely feel that our marriage was coming to an end. Gradually, I stopped feeling angry toward my husband, and it seemed that he also sensed I was living with only cold, distant emotions. He started coming home less and less, using his busy work as an excuse. He worked in a department that required frequent business trips, so I didn't suspect anything at first. But one day, I found a hotel receipt and a membership card for a business hotel near our nearest train station in my husband's suit pocket. The receipts pointed to the fact that he had stayed at the hotel on the days he claimed to be on business trips, and the membership card had accumulated points that seemed excessive for just one night. Originally, my husband was quite popular with women at his workplace, being considered a rising star in his career. I thought he must have found another woman besides me. He was having a good time with that person, so I didn't need to be the only one suffering. I started going out at night and packed my schedule with activities even on my days off, trying not to be outdone by my husband. I was having fun and played around for a while, but I eventually became exhausted. I couldn't enjoy those times genuinely, and I grew tired of forcing myself to smile. Maybe it's time for me to have my own freedom soon. Neither of us were really facing each other as a married couple. We were both avoiding each other. If my husband could be happier with someone else besides me, then perhaps it's better that way. I thought it was time for me to move on to a new stage in life as well. Still, I loved my husband, whom I had once wanted to spend my whole life with. It took a lot of courage for me to bring up divorce, and I also had feelings of doubt, wondering if there was no other way but to end it. But it seems my husband already has a new girlfriend. After days of agonizing, I made up my mind and sent a text message to my husband. "Will you be finishing work early today? I have something to talk to you about." I received a response immediately.
"I've got something to talk about, too. I'll try to come home as soon as possible."
Despite having made up my mind for a divorce, I had mistakenly assumed that my husband wouldn't want a divorce either. My husband wanted a divorce too. Just thinking that sent my heart constricting, making it hard to breathe, and it was even difficult to stand. But my husband's heart had already left me and gone to someone else. I should stop crying. I wanted to end it with a smile, at least this one last time. I stilled myself and waited for him to come home. He eventually returned home around 9 p.m. My husband, whom I faced head-on after a long time, was surprisingly thin. His kind eyes and tone remained the same, but there was a distance between us that seemed impossible to bridge. My husband was originally a man of few words, and while I was talking, he often lowered his gaze and remained silent except for occasional nods. I had wanted to end it with respect for my husband until the end, but I couldn't help feeling that he was making a fool of me. Even though we, who had been married for a short time, were choosing to part ways, why wouldn't he even express his own feelings? I gradually became frustrated and started arguing with him. Still, my husband remained silent and listened to my words. I wanted to somehow make him speak, so I mentioned the existence of his new girlfriend. He must have thought I hadn't noticed. If he realized that I saw through everything, wouldn't he rush to make excuses? Upon hearing my words, my husband looked surprised and, for a moment, let out a smile. And after a short pause, he said, "So, you found out, huh?" Strangely enough, I couldn't help but laugh at his nonchalant reply, and he started laughing as well. It was the first time in a long while that we, as a married couple, laughed together. Despite the seriousness of the situation, I was happy that we could laugh together like we used to. After that, strangely enough, we were able to talk just like before. Perhaps my husband realized I had seen through his affair. My husband's expression looked remarkably relieved. "Let's stop blaming each other. I don't want to hate you anymore." My proposal was accepted by my husband, and we decided to sort out our shared belongings so that either of us could leave at any time. All of them were precious memories, but they were all things that I wanted to put somewhere out of sight for a while. My husband, who was the type that would get attached to personal belongings for a long time, was then putting them into garbage bags without hesitation. His decisiveness overwhelmed me. Late into the night, the room was cleared, and only our belongings remained. At that point, my husband said to me, "Take whatever you want. I'm the one who's at fault for everything. Can you forgive me?" It seemed that tears welled up in my husband's eyes. Had he also started feeling lonely while tidying up? I understood that feeling very well because I felt the same way. "You still have some time to think about it. Let's sort things out little by little." After finishing the initial sorting, we decided to call it a day. As I soaked in the bath, I sorted through my thoughts. We were still legally married, so I should be able to get alimony from my husband, who had cheated on me, but it was clear that our relationship as a couple had already come to an end. Moreover, I didn't want to do anything that would further tarnish our memories. When I got out of the bath and prepared to sleep, my husband, who had just finished taking a bath, entered the bedroom. He slipped into bed and gently pulled me close. "Hey, this is a bit strange, isn't it? And it's not fair to her either." I stiffened, and my husband spoke as if he was squeezing out his words.
"Just once more. I just want you by my side."
My husband's body, which enveloped me, was trembling slightly. "Are you crying?" I asked, but he didn't answer. As I stroked his back, his body felt lighter and more bony than before. "Hey, are you feeling well? You seem to have lost some weight," I inquired, and my husband's trembling stopped abruptly. Then, when I withdrew from his body, he took a deep breath and said, "I've been working on getting into shape lately." "I see. Is there anything else? Are you really okay?" Touching his body was a rare occurrence in itself, but I was really surprised by how different it felt from before. He had originally had a sturdy and muscular build. Certainly, he liked to work out, and even when he was busy, he never skipped his training. She prefers me having a well-toned body, my husband said. And at that time, I realized he did it for her, didn't he? I couldn't help but feel lonely again. If he loved her enough to change his body, he should just forget about me quickly. Is that so? Well, since it's the last day, you don't have to cry. Oh, could it be tears of joy? I said that sarcastically to hold back my sadness. My husband chuckled lightly and said, "You haven't changed at all. I like that about you. Starting tomorrow, please live a happy life, wherever you may be. That's the only thing I'm praying for." My husband said that and started to snore. He really was a person who would do things at his own pace until the end. "I'm wishing for that too," I whispered to his sleeping face, and then I fell asleep as well. Perhaps due to staying up late tidying up the room the previous day, I overslept the next morning. When I woke up, my husband was no longer in bed. I went to the living room, and on the table, there was an A4-sized envelope, inside of which were a passbook and numerous documents. I took everything out, and it turned out to be related to our marital assets. In addition, the passbook in my name had a surprisingly large amount of money in it. And from a small envelope, a divorce document appeared. My husband's part was already filled out, and it seemed I just had to fill in my part and submit it. I hurriedly called his cell phone, but it seemed to have already been canceled, and I couldn't reach him. Over the course of a few days, I asked my husband's family and friends about his whereabouts, but no one would tell me anything. I reluctantly contacted his workplace, only to find out that my workaholic husband had resigned several months ago. I would have understood if he had found a new girlfriend and left, but why did it have to come to this? And why wouldn't anyone tell me anything? I fell into a mild paranoia, but it seemed I had no way to contact my husband anymore. I was crushed by the mental fatigue that had been building up even before the divorce. My husband had even prepared alimony for me, so I was free to go to my favorite place. It was a remote island that takes almost a day to reach from the state I lived in. The island had only around 3,000 residents, and depopulation was progressing. I had visited the island with my husband once before as tourists, and I was captivated by the island's nature and its slow-paced way of life. It was also a place where we had promised to visit again when his work finally settles down. While there were memories with my husband, what I needed then was probably the tranquility of that place. And a few months later, I decided to rent out the house where we had lived during our married life and quit my job to move to this remote island. I felt that I had made a bold decision, but I felt that I couldn't continue living in that house anymore. I didn't know how my husband had managed to pay off the mortgage, but I understood that he had put in a lot of effort. But there were too many memories for me to continue living there alone. However, I didn't want to completely let go of it and turn my husband's efforts into nothing. There were many strange things, but I couldn't ask my husband anymore. In this quiet island, I planned to spend my time while occasionally letting go of the past. I was starting to get used to the island life, and I had become acquainted with my neighbors. Living a simple life, I realized that doing nothing made me feel even more depressed, so I started working as a helper, helping the elderly in the neighborhood. At first, I was treated as an outsider, but as I got used to the job, I was happy to be accepted as a member of the island community. Just as I was finding my place, I heard from my colleagues at work that the new client who had requested assistance was someone who had come from the US for medical treatment. This person had fallen into a situation with no hope of recovery and had chosen this island as his final resting place. Moving to this island in that condition must have required considerable determination, considering there were no medical facilities here. I was thinking that it would be quite challenging when I received a new request from this client, and since I had no prior commitments, I ended up being assigned to visit him. I had heard about his medical condition, so I was a bit nervous as I headed to his home. Upon arrival, I found a small house on a hill overlooking the sea. I had heard that it had been vacant for a long time and had been renovated to a livable condition when he moved in, but it was really just a house that could provide basic shelter from nature. I wonder if it's really okay for him to spend his final moments here? I couldn't help but worry as I rang the doorbell of the house. Finally, a faint voice said, "Please come in." I gave my usual greetings and went inside, finding the client sitting by a window where the sunlight and breeze streamed in. I couldn't see his face clearly due to the backlight, so I approached him with squinted eyes. "Nice to meet you. I'll be assisting you from today," I said, turning to look at his face, and I was left speechless. There, seated before me, was my husband, or rather, my ex-husband. We both stared at each other in surprise, not uttering a word. My husband was the first to break the silence.
"So, my disguise is all blown, ho."
He chuckled mischievously, just like before. "What are you doing here?" I was astonished by his unexpected presence, and my thoughts became a tangled mess as I recalled the information I had gathered from my colleagues before coming here. I was too bewildered to speak coherently. My husband took my hand, which had gone limp, and guided me to sit beside him. He held my hand and stayed seated, patiently waiting for me to calm down. I gradually regained my composure, but I couldn't bring myself to ask about my husband's condition. Instead, he kept apologizing while holding me gently. Words to say to my husband eluded me, so I sat there silently, and I heard a voice from the entrance announcing a visitor. I wiped away my tears and headed to the entrance, where an elderly man was standing. He looked a bit surprised when he saw my tear-stained face, but nodded in greeting and entered, taking a seat next to my husband. "How is everything today?" he asked in a gentle tone. My husband replied that there hadn't been any significant changes, and they soon started chatting. The elderly man was probably the island's sole doctor. There were no hospitals on this island, and my colleagues had mentioned that the nurse and doctor at the clinic were this island's lifelines. So, it seemed my husband had indeed come to terms with spending his final moments on this island. Despite my husband's decision, I wondered if there was anything I could do. I listened intently to their conversation. However, after about 10 minutes of small talk, the doctor stood up to take his leave. Feeling restless, I followed the doctor outside. I must have surprised him again with my hurried appearance, but when I explained that we used to be married, he seemed to understand. I asked him about my husband's condition and his future treatment, but the doctor gently scolded me, saying, "I can't discuss it without his consent." Although he didn't provide any details, it seemed he felt sorry for my disappointment. I imagine he has very little time left to walk on his own. Spending his last moments alone wouldn't be ideal, so please stay by his side, the doctor suggested, and I was taken aback. What had happened to my husband's girlfriend? After parting ways with the doctor, I returned to where my husband was waiting for me. He had anticipated that I would question the doctor and greeted me with a smile while saying, "You're finally back." I couldn't bring myself to detach from the situation and leave my husband behind, so I decided to ask my husband if I could stay overnight. His house had only the bare essentials, and there was just one set of beddings for a single bed. It was the first time we shared a bed since the day we discussed our divorce. As we lay together, wrapped in the tight blanket, we recounted our journey to this point. I had wanted to ask about his illness, but seeing him so cheerful, I decided that it wasn't the right time to make him talk about something painful. Instead, we reminisced about old times. I also had another reason for this, thoughts about his relationship with her. Before I mentioned that I was planning to stay, I asked him why he hadn't brought her to this island. He chuckled briefly in response, avoiding a direct answer. His silence may have indicated that something sad had happened. I was careful not to probe too deeply, as I didn't want to reopen any emotional wounds he might have. The next day, I explained my situation to my workplace and decided to take some time off. I wanted to spend as much time as possible with my husband during those uncertain days. I placed my husband, who could hardly walk, in a wheelchair, and we visited various places on the island. We went to places we had memories of, places we had never been to before, and scenic spots I wanted to share with him. Even without conversation, just being together was enough. Nothing felt lacking. I wish we could have been this close when we were married. Even after our divorce, I realized that my feelings for him had grown even stronger. But it was too late for that now. Telling him would only confuse matters. I thought I would continue to stay by his side in our nearly friendship-like relationship. We enjoyed our days together, but the illness was slowly consuming my husband. His physical strength declined to the point where he could no longer go out, even for a walk. Simple daily activities became difficult, and he began to doze off more frequently. The doctor visited us every day, and the absence of pain was the only relief, as this was a natural progression. The thought of parting with my husband so soon was inconceivable, and I was filled with disbelief. I cared for my husband, who might never wake up again, to ensure he wouldn't feel lonely when he did. Sometimes, when he woke up briefly, he would talk as if continuing a dream or speak of distant memories as if they had just happened. Every moment was precious, and that love only deepened my sadness. Later on, my husband stopped waking up altogether. Even when our conversations ceased, I stayed by his side, reading his favorite books and describing the scenery I thought he would want to know about. One day, as I wanted to share the beautiful sunset with him, I was about to speak while holding his hand. However, I noticed that his hand had grown cold. The intervals between his breaths were longer, and only his chest moved unnaturally, rising and falling. Panicking, I called the doctor, and he promised to come right away, but I felt a crushing sense of helplessness in the face of the situation. I desperately wished it was some sort of mistake. I wanted the doctor to say, "He's fine." However, when the doctor arrived and examined my husband, he said, "His blood pressure has dropped significantly. Let's make it peaceful for him. I think he wants you by his side. I'll step out. If anything happens, I'll come back immediately, so stay with him and be at peace." The doctor said that and left my husband, telling him his final goodbye. That was really it. I knew it was coming, but it was still so painful. I'm truly happy to have met you in this life. We had difficulties, but deep down, I've always loved you. I whispered these words into my husband's ear, holding his hand gently. And then, my husband's hand weakly squeezed mine in response. It was perhaps medically impossible, but I felt it distinctly. Shortly afterward, my husband exhaled his last breath and passed away quietly. I couldn't contain my tears, but I was grateful that I could be with him in his chosen final moments. From my husband's passing to his interment, everything moved swiftly, and I had no time to dwell in sadness. When I finally returned home after clearing out my husband's belongings, I noticed a mountain of mail piled up. As I looked through them one by one, I came across a familiar handwriting, and I was astonished. There were dozens of letters from my husband there. Despite my daily presence by his side to ensure we wouldn't be apart, somehow, I hadn't noticed. My husband's letters began from the day of our reunion. It seemed my husband had moved to this place with faint hopes of meeting me again, but he hadn't really believed it would happen. He was surprised but found it challenging not to show his joy. His letters were filled with his trademark humor, and I couldn't help but smile. Knowing that he had hoped for this meant the world to me. Looking at the dates, it seemed he had mailed them every day, but as the days passed, his handwriting became more erratic, the content of the letters shorter, and the progression of his illness was painfully evident. As I read through them with a heavy heart, I stopped at one particular letter. It contained the truth about our divorce. His battle with illness had begun while we were still married. By the time it was discovered, it was beyond treatment, and even the last-ditch effort he had undertaken had proven ineffective. He didn't want to burden me with a life alongside his illness, so he had devised a plan, and I had unwittingly fallen into his strategy. While he didn't expect me to suspect another woman's existence, he thought I might accept a substantial settlement, and I didn't deny it. I no longer needed any treatment, so I settled everything, and I wanted you to live comfortably, he wrote. I thought of the hurtful words I had thrown at him, knowing then that he had fought so deeply for my well-being. I'm so sorry. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. Then, I heard a knock on the door. I quickly wiped away my tears and opened the door to find the doctor standing there. "Doctor, why have you come?" I asked, and he handed me an envelope. The envelope was the same as the one I was reading my husband's letters.
He asked me to mail them every day. Some of them are written ahead for the days when he won't regain consciousness. I was entrusted with this, and I couldn't refuse. This is his final letter. He asked me to give it to you when you return home.
I see. This was truly my husband's last letter. I thanked the doctor and, once again, faced my husband's letter alone. With a calm heart, I opened it, and there, faintly written, were the words, "Thank you. I love you." We had taken the long way around, but our hearts had remained connected. I love you too. As I said that, it felt like my husband's portrait at the corner of the room smiled ever so slightly. Several decades have passed since my husband's passing, and I still live on this island. I'm now recognized as one of the island's residents. On the day when I thought I would never leave this island, I placed my husband's tombstone right next to his house. He must still be enjoying the view he was looking at every day. One day, I plan to join him there, surrounded by the memories of our life together. Until that time comes, I will continue to live this peaceful and fulfilling life.